All right, what is an argument? Let's talk about this. This is possibly the most important lecture of the entire semester. Arguments at the very heart of Philosophy 101. The crux of Philosophy 101 is understanding what arguments are. So an argument, first of all, in philosophy doesn't mean a quarrel. Matter of fact, there don't even have to be people involved. You can just look at something written on a piece of paper and that can be called an argument. What an argument is a set of statements, including some premises and a conclusion, and then the premises are supposed to lead logically to the conclusion. So it's a set of statements with premises and a conclusion, the premises leading to the conclusion. So we're going to talk about what statement means, what premise means, what conclusion means, what it means to lead logically to it. All that is coming up. Here's an example, though, to work from. Suppose we're asking the question, should we use capital punishment? And somebody answers, yes, because it deters crime. Then they've given a claim, yes, we should use capital punishment, and a reason for the claim, because it deters crime. And that is enough to build an argument from. You need both the claim, which will be the conclusion, and the reason, which will be the premise. So the argument will look something like this. 1, capital punishment deters crime. There's my reason. 2, therefore, we should use it. Yes, there's my claim. So premise and the conclusion. So the premise is what you start with as sort of an assumption. You're saying, since this is true, therefore, we should use capital punishment. So both of those things are statements. Capital punishment deters crime is a statement. We should use it is a statement. A statement is a sentence which is either true or false. Now, that means that questions are not statements. Shouldn't we use capital punishment is not a statement. Commands are not statements. Would you please shut the door is not a statement. Topics are not statements. If somebody says my topic is capital punishment, you can't have 1, capital punishment. 2, it deters crime. Because each numbered statement here needs to be a full statement that's either true or false. It doesn't mean that we have to know whether the sentence is true or false. There's life on other planets counts as a statement. Because either it's true that there's life on other planets, or it's false that there's life on other planets. I don't have to know which is the case. The point is it's still a statement. Now, it might be a true statement. It might be a false statement. We just don't know which. Similarly, statements that we have no way of investigating still can be statements. If somebody says, there's a God, we probably can't, in this life anyway, determine whether that's true or not in a way that would satisfy everybody. So, but it's still a statement. Either it's true that there's a God, or it's false that there's a God. There either is a God or there isn't. And so saying there's a God is a statement. People may disagree on whether it's a true or a false one, but it is a statement. Saying that something is right or wrong is a statement. It's either true that murder is wrong, or it's false that murder is wrong. Either true that capital punishment is wrong, or false that capital punishment is wrong. We just don't always know which. So a statement just is anything that's either true or false. A proposition, by the way, means exactly the same thing as a statement in this class. In some levels of philosophy, they make a slight distinction between the two, but we're not going to make that distinction. So sometimes the book will use the term proposition, and sometimes I'll tend to use the term statement more often, but they're interchangeable. Now, when you make an argument, the premise, like capital punishment deters crime, is being used to prove the conclusion. Therefore, we should use capital punishment. And the premise is something that the arguer hopes the listener already agrees with. So what I'm saying to you is, look, we should use capital punishment. You say, why? And I say, because it deters crime. Don't you agree? And my hope is that you'll say, sure, I agree it deters crime, and then I'll be able to say, therefore, you can see that we should use it. So the arguer hopes that the listener already agrees with the premise. Every premise that means is an assumption that you're hoping the listener shares with you. You cannot avoid having assumptions in arguments. Every argument requires assumptions. If you don't have assumptions of some kind, you can't make the argument. You have to start somewhere. So don't be afraid of having an assumption in an argument. That doesn't make it wrong. Matter of fact, there have to be assumptions in an argument just to have enough to go on. So the question isn't whether there's assumptions. The question is whether those assumptions make sense. The question is whether those assumptions are things that the other side is willing to accept, to acknowledge. If I'm making assumptions that you agree with, then that's no problem. The only problem is if I try to sneak in an assumption that you disagree with, and then my argument won't work for you. Okay, so premises equals assumptions here, and every premise is something that we're assuming. So get away from the idea that you can't have any assumptions. Everything except the conclusion will be an assumption. Okay, the arguer also hopes that if the listener accepts the premise, he'll agree that the conclusion must be true also. In other words, he says, therefore. He says, if you agree that capital punishment deters crime, I hope you'll see that that means that we should use it. So he's hoping that I'm thinking like a programmer, he's hoping that the listener will accept the premise as being true, but he's also hoping that the listener will accept that if the premise is true, so is the conclusion. And so that means there's two ways for an argument to go wrong. One is the strength of the premises, and one is the validity of the argument. By the strength of the premises, I mean the question of the user hopes that the listener agrees with the assumptions. If I make a bunch of premises in my argument and there are things that you agree with, all is well, as far as the strength of the premises. But if I make an argument and one of the premises is something you disagree with, the argument's not going to work. So suppose I'm arguing for capital punishment, and I say capital punishment deters crime, therefore we should use it. The question I have to ask is, how strong is this argument? Does it go wrong in any way? One way it could go wrong is if somebody could disagree with one. So the question you have to ask yourself is it possible that somebody could disagree with one? Could they think capital punishment doesn't deter crime? Notice that they thought that this argument wouldn't work for them at all. You'd say, well, first of all, it deters crime, and they would say, no, it doesn't, and you'd be stuck. There would be nowhere to go from there. So if it's true that somebody could disagree with it, as in this case is certainly the case, then we need to do something to strengthen the argument if we can. How could you strengthen it? Well, in this case, since you need them to believe one and they don't, you need to give it more support. In other words, so you might say several studies have demonstrated a link between executions and decreases in murder rates. And now they might accept one. And say, oh, okay, I guess you're right. Capital punishment does deter crime. So what you're doing in that case, if you think about it, is giving another argument, but this time just an argument for statement 1. And then you're using statement 1 to prove statement 2. So your new argument looks like this. It's really two arguments. First of all, several studies have demonstrated a link between executions and decreases in murder rates. Therefore, capital punishment deters crime. And then you're following that with another argument that says capital punishment deters crime. Therefore, we should use capital punishment. Usually, and so the arguer is hoping, again, you've got a premise. In that very first argument, you've got a premise that says several studies have demonstrated a link between executions and decreases in murder rates. So the arguer is hoping that the listener already agrees with that. Or, if he doesn't, that they can just show him the studies and then he'll agree. You can say, here, look at these studies that show a link, and then he'll agree with it. And therefore, you're hoping you can prove to him from that therefore capital punishment deters crime. The simple version would be to combine these two into one big argument that would look like this. 1, several studies have demonstrated a link between executions and decreases in murder rates. That's a pure premise. You're assuming that he'll agree with you, at least if you show him the evidence. 2, therefore, capital punishment deters crime. That's not an assumption you're asking him to make anymore. You're hoping that he will agree that comes logically from number 1. That if you show him number 1, he'll just have to agree with 2. And then, therefore, we should use capital punishment. What you've really got here is two arguments hooked together. The first argument gets to 2, and then the second argument uses 2 to get to 3. Okay, so this is all helping you understand how arguments work. I said there were two ways for an argument to go wrong. The other way for an argument to go wrong is in terms of the validity of the argument. Now, if an argument is valid, that means something very, very specific in Philosophy 101. It's got a very specific meaning. Saying that an argument is valid says something more than just you think it's okay to make. It says something very specific. So let's talk about what that means. We've got here this argument, capital punishment deters crime, therefore we should use it. I said that we hope that the listener accepts 1, but there's something else we're hoping. We're hoping that if the listener accepts 1, he'll also agree that the conclusion has to be true. We're hoping that if we say, look, capital punishment deters crime, and he says, yes, it does, that he'll agree that means we should use it. So that's the question. Could someone actually agree with statement 1 and still disagree with the conclusion? Now, notice the difference between this and the last thing. The last thing we asked was, could somebody disagree with statement 1? Could they disagree with the assumption? Now we're asking, could they actually agree with the assumption and still disagree with the conclusion? In other words, could somebody say something like, oh, I agree it deters, but I still don't think we should use it? And that be logically okay. I think if you think about it, you'll agree that somebody could say that. They might say, I don't care whether it deters crime, I still think it's just inhumane to use it. And it's wrong even if it does deter crime. So they would be willing to accept 1, but they wouldn't let you conclude 2. So here the problem isn't that you need to strengthen premise 1. The problem isn't the assumption in premise 1, because they're willing to accept that. The problem is the link between premise 1 and premise 2. It's in the therefore. It's whether that word therefore is justified. So if this happens, if somebody can disagree that link is there, we say the argument is not valid. Now that doesn't mean this is a useless argument. It just means that as it is, it has this weakness. This weakness that we don't know for sure, we can't say for sure that just accepting statement 1 would lead you to statement 2. The therefore isn't really enough of a therefore. It doesn't force you to get to statement 2. That's what it means for an argument to not be valid. And to be valid is the opposite. To be valid means that the argument is such that if you did accept the premises, you would have to accept the conclusion. That's what a valid argument is. So if you say anywhere through this course that an argument is valid, that's what I expect you to mean. That anybody who accepts the premises would have to accept the conclusion logically. All right, so let's talk more about this. Suppose we look at this and realize that it's not valid, because somebody could say, I agree that capital punishment deters crime and still think we shouldn't use it. Usually what you should do if you find that your argument is invalid is look for an unstated premise. In other words, the reason it seemed valid at first to you was because you were assuming something else that hasn't been said. And in this case, the unstated premise is that we should do whatever we can to deter crime. So our real argument was something like this. 1, capital punishment deters crime, and 2, we should do whatever we can to deter crime. And 3, therefore, we should use capital punishment. That's sort of the argument that was really being made, even though nobody ever said to. Now, if you look at this argument and ask, is it valid? What you're asking is, could somebody agree with both statements 1 and 2 and still disagree with the conclusion? Suppose you say to me, capital punishment deters crime, and I say, I agree. And you say, we should do whatever we can to deter crime, and I say, I agree. And then you say, therefore, we should use capital punishment. Do I really sort of have to accept that if I agree with the first two? And the answer is, yes, I do. Someone couldn't agree, that is, no, it's not invalid. Someone couldn't agree with statements 1 and 2 and still disagree with the conclusion. Statements 1 and 2 really force the conclusion. So this argument is valid. Now, this is valid, but that doesn't mean the argument is completely as strong as it should be, because remember, there's 2 ways for it to go wrong. The other way for it to go wrong is that the listener might not accept the premises. And now we've got another premise. So not only are we hoping that he accepts number 1, the capital punishment deters crime, we've also got to hope that he accepts number 2, we should do whatever we can to deter crime. And he might not agree with the second one. If the listener disagrees with the premise 2, then it still won't be an argument that works for him. Now we'll have to go back and find a way to support that, to strengthen that. We'll have to figure out how would we argue to show that we should do whatever we can to deter crime. So you can sort of go round and around. Let's go back to example and use the opposite argument. Should we use capital punishment? So suppose somebody says no, because it doesn't deter crime. They've got a claim, no, we shouldn't. You've got a reason for the claim. It doesn't deter crime. That again gets turned to an argument like this. The premise is it doesn't deter crime. The conclusion is therefore we shouldn't use it. Let's think about this argument. Now there's a much better argument than this one perhaps, but let's think about this one. 2 ways for the argument to go wrong. First thing is, we hope that the listener already agrees with the premise. So are the premises strong enough? Could somebody disagree with premise 1? Could they say, I don't agree that it doesn't deter crime? If so, then it may need more support. So you might say, well, according to medical experts, capital punishment does not deter crime. I found that on a website somewhere. So in that case, your argument would be, according to medical experts, capital punishment does not deter crime. Therefore, capital punishment doesn't deter crime. And therefore, we should not use capital punishment. And this would be one way to argue this. And hold on. So that would be similar to what we did before. You come up with some support for premise 1. Now the problem is, of course, that these 2 arguments that we have contradict each other. The top one says, according to medical experts, capital punishment does not deter crime, therefore it doesn't deter it, therefore we shouldn't use it. And the bottom one says, several studies have demonstrated a link between executions and decreases, therefore it does deter crime, therefore we should use it. These are both things that I found out on the internet, by the way. There are people arguing the top one, and there are people arguing the bottom one. What's the big difference? The difference is on those first premises. They actually disagree with each other. So here you're going to have to decide what to do with that. One common way to deal with this is to go back and compare the credibility of the sources. Another thing to ask is, maybe they're both true in some way, and yet we have to decide how to compare which one matters. Does it matter what medical experts say? Do the studies really demonstrate that strong a link? You have to take a lot more investigation. So that's typically what you do if you write, say, like an English research paper. You look at different sources, you compare what different people are saying. But I'm interested in something very different here, because there's another way for this argument to go wrong. Remember, the validity of the argument. The arguer hopes that if the listener accepts the premise, he'll agree the conclusion must be true also. Could someone agree with statement 1, say, I don't think it does deter crime, and still disagree that we shouldn't use it? Could he say, I agree it doesn't deter, but I still think we should use it? For example, could somebody say, I don't think the purpose of capital punishment is to deter crime. I think the purpose is to bring justice. And if somebody's committed certain crimes, they need to be put to death for justice to happen. It doesn't matter whether it deters other people or not. It's just something we should still do. It is possible for somebody to say that logically, right? And so that means you don't have to accept 2 just because you accept 1, and that means this isn't valid. So this argument isn't valid. So if the argument's not valid, you look for an unstated premise. How come we thought that not deterring crime led to our not using it? Well, we must have been assuming that the only legitimate reason to use it was if it deterred crime. So if it didn't, that just meant we shouldn't. So the new argument is something like this. Capital punishment doesn't deter crime. The only legitimate reason to use capital punishment is if it deters crime, and therefore we shouldn't use capital punishment. That's a valid argument. But of course, now you have another premise that the listener might not accept. Will they accept that the only legitimate reason to use capital punishment is if it deters crime? And if they won't, then you'll have to support it with an additional argument. Now, most people, when they argue against capital punishment, argue on grounds of it being inhumane. So you'd probably have something like this. 1, capital punishment is inhumane. 2, we should avoid doing inhumane things without a really strong reason. And 3, of all the reasons for capital punishment, the only one that's really strong is the need to deter crime. And therefore, the only legitimate reason to use capital punishment, since it's inhumane, is if it deters crime. But on the other hand, 5, capital punishment doesn't deter crime, therefore we shouldn't use it. This is a valid argument that might be pretty convincing. You'd still have to make sure that whoever you're talking to accepted, 1, that it's inhumane, which they might not. If not, you'd have to prove that some other way. You'd still have to get them to accept that you shouldn't do inhumane things without a really good reason. You should try to avoid doing inhumane things. And they might accept that. You still have to get them to agree that even though there may be many reasons for capital punishment, that the only really strong one is the need to deter crime. I suspect they often wouldn't agree with that either. And you'd still have to get them to accept number 5, that capital punishment doesn't deter crime. Okay, so here's our summary. An argument is a set of statements, I should say statements, consisting of premises leading to a conclusion. Premises are assumptions. All arguments require assumptions. There are 2 ways for an argument to go wrong. One is the strength of the premises. The arguer hopes the listener will agree that the premises are true, and if he doesn't, then to fix the problem, you may have to provide a separate argument for the premise in question. And the validity of the argument. The arguer hopes that if the listener accepts the premises, he'll agree the conclusion must be true also. To fix that problem, you're going to have to look for some unstated premises and figure out what they should have been. Okay, that's that. Thank you.